And I had a daughter that was due, that was along the way. So I had to start considering the issue of pedobaptism, which is, just a fancy word for infant baptism, baptizing your infants. And I had to start considering that issue. Of course, Baptists don't practice that.
Right.
So I started to look at Scripture on that issue. I started to read the early church fathers on pedobaptism to see if there's any merit to this. Because, hey, if I need to baptize my daughter, I want to do this. I don't want to be negligent in my duties to my children. So I began to consider the issue, and I became convinced of pedobaptism. So by the time my daughter was born, I had converted to Presbyterianism. So I became Reformed and had my daughter baptized. And of course, in the Reformed community, they often emphasize church history. I mean, some Baptists may emphasize church history, some Protestants do, but the Reformed more so. So I started to study church history. And
one of the struggles with all those groups, God bless our baptized brothers and sisters, is how do you deal with history given their own spin on tradition and Scripture? And the Baptists, have their own trail of blood view of history. That, of course, and the Presbyterians feel a little more comfortable with a lot of history.
A little more comfortable.
Just to mention that to our radio listeners, our guest is Michael Lofton, former Baptist and Presbyterian. So you jump in the Presbyterian. I made the same switch I did after seminary. Went Presbyterian because I felt, at least here's a group that's got the collection of the wisest of the wise throughout history with their creeds and the Book of Order.
Yeah, and they had some sense of historicity to their faith.
Right.
This wasn't, for them, in their eyes, wasn't something that was made up overnight. For them, they thought they were in continuity with the early church. Well, I decided to test that hypothesis because the Protestant narrative is essentially that, at least according to the Reformed, is that the earlier Christians were essentially, Protestant, essentially in doctrine, but the Catholics came along generally in the Middle Ages and corrupted the faith, and the Reformers, the magisterial Reformers like Calvin and Luther and Zwingli, had to pretty much restore the church to the way it was in the early days of Christianity. So I decided, let's test that hypothesis. Let's see if that's true. And so I began to study church history. From a Protestant perspective, I began to read Protestant historians like J.M.D. Kelly, Philip Schaff, Henry Chadwick, Bruce Shelley, Everett Ferguson. I mean, I can go on and on. I began to read all of these guys, all of their church history books, and then I started to see these guys don't really seem Protestant. Not the writers, but the early church Christians. They didn't really seem Protestant in their doctrine. I mean, you have J.M.D. Kelly talking about the earlier Christians had a larger canon than Protestants do today and believed in the Eucharist and things like that. So I said, all right, well, let me actually turn to the church fathers themselves. So I began to read the church fathers themselves. I started studying the apostolic fathers, which are those church fathers that pretty much span from the time of the apostles or right after their death until roughly, late 2nd century, early 3rd century, right around there. I read all of the apostolic fathers. Everything that they had, except for one exception, because there was a book by Irenaeus that was just released, so I had not read that one. But anyways, I read all of the apostolic fathers, began to read the Nicene and post-Nicene fathers, which those are pretty much from the 2nd century to 750 AD. Began to read all those guys, St. John Chrysostom, Augustine, St. Bede, John Damascene, you name them. And I thought, these guys were not Protestant. I mean, you have some of these apostolic fathers in the early 2nd century talking about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, saying that the Gnostics would abstain from eating the body and blood of Christ. They would abstain from the Eucharist because they, of course, didn't believe Jesus had a body, so they refused to eat his body and blood. And he's speaking in reference to the Eucharist. I'm thinking, wow, this is a guy who sat at the feet of the apostles. This is at the turn of the 2nd century, and here he is talking about Catholic doctrine, essentially transubstantiation. Kind of shocked me.